Hey gang, we're the Bittersweet Gamers. And what important lesson did we learn today?
Make sure an episode is up on YouTube before deleting it and all related source files forever. I'm the Opinionator.
Very good. I'm We Squared, and now you get to explain to the class what happened.
Yeah, so it's just like I said. I somehow managed to, in my brilliance, delete episode 52.
And so now we're recording this.
Right. All that actually happens in episode 52 is it starts a dungeon, as you'll see in just a few minutes. And we don't need to actually play through a bunch of dungeon stuff.
I'm looking forward to it. That was sarcasm.
There is one important thing in here, and we're going to show that. However, the thing that we promised at the end of last episode was that we were going to explain all of our thoughts on who the killer is.
Yeah.
And give the evidence for it. But this is kind of the important part.
Yeah.
Come on.
Do you see the resemblance?
Forget the girls. Look at Thomas.
Yeah.
Right there next to Carol.
I like how you...
Carol? Zach, look.
York's not even mentioning him.
Emily.
Thomas. York doesn't say a thing, and yeah, it's creepy that Emily's in that dress, and what does this mean? Why does Harry have this painting? But more importantly, why is Thomas there?
Why indeed?
This is the way it's gonna be. In the episode I deleted, we talked about a whole bunch of different characters, why they were or were not suspicious, and presented our evidence for it. Well, we're not gonna do that this time. We're just gonna bring up the people that matter. From the moment we found George's house surrounded by those conspicuous red trees with all this ivy running all up and down the walls, that's when we realized Deadly Premonition was telling us everything from the beginning.
So here's our theory up to this point. We believe that George killed Anna, but we think Thomas killed Becky and Diane.
Let's start with the obvious one, George.
According to the profiling, what does the raincoat killer have on his back? An upside down peace mark. We know it's a frickin' tree. And what does George have on his back?
Let's take a really close look. Way back when, after the lumber mill, York asked to see Emily and George's back.
And what was he looking for? A tree mark.
And when he saw George's back, there were a whole bunch of scars.
Incidentally, the scars on George's back came from a tree.
He didn't want to talk about them at the time, but there was something awfully funny about the way that we first saw those scars on George's back.
The lighting was far too bright to really make anything out. But if you look at the tree mark here...
If you notice, there's a strong line in the center, the trunk, and then two off-center intersecting lines. And on George's back, there's a strong center line and two off-center lines that intersect. Huh. As far as I'm concerned, that seals it right there.
It seems pretty obvious. We found out recently that Thomas has a pretty interesting wig.
A pretty familiar wig, too. Why, it seems as though it's the one that the killer is wearing in profiling. But what does that have to do with George? Since the game has recently implicated Thomas extremely strongly and very directly, the presence of the wig would seem to indicate that Thomas is the killer.
We have seen Thomas's back, but it just had a tattoo that said, "I love G."
George, of course. And if you look at the profiling, there's one thing that's very clear about Anna's murder. See this strong, beefy, bulky arm? Thomas doesn't have an arm like that. But George does. He pumps iron, and he's demonstrated his brute strength before.
But if you look at the profiling in Becky's house and the Muse's gallery, you see that the Raincoat Killer is sporting some pretty noodly arms himself.
How do you justify that? Well, the answer is, they're not the same person. We're dealing with two different killers.
The new Raincoat Killer and the more newer Raincoat Killer.
It's more than just arms that make them distinct, though. It's also behavior. Again, we saw in the profiling at Anna's tree that when Anna was killed, the killer was very reverent and worshipped her like a goddess. A goddess of the forest!
Dancing under the sun! But Becky and Diane were not killed reverently. They were actually kind of brutally killed. Almost as if the killer were angry.
Remember, the key difference we're trying to point out is that the murder of Anna was reverent, in a way that was holy, even sacred.
In Becky's case, it was like something out of Saw.
And there's nothing reverent about George just setting off a trap.
And on one final note, there was something that George said at the bar.
I could have saved them both.
Why would George talk about saving Becky and Diane? You don't talk about saving people if you were there to kill them in the first place. If he was trying to hide something that he did, he wouldn't have brought it up at all. And he never said he could have saved Anna. Now that we know about the rules for the new Raincoat Killer, and that it's something that supposedly can lead to immortality, it looks like the method and motivation behind these murders so far, Anna and then Becky and Diane, are completely different. And that's why we think it's two different people. We know that Thomas is in the secret sex ring. And Thomas also recently suspiciously disappeared after suspiciously taking the suspicious sealed files. We don't know what Thomas's motive would be, but we know Thomas doesn't have the tree mark on his back. It's easier to fake a mark on your back than it is to buff up your arms. Maybe Thomas is trying to frame George. Maybe George is trying to frame Thomas. When it comes to this point, all we can do is speculate. But based on behaviors, I do think it's clear that there are two different killers. But we do know he is clearly deeply connected to these murders. And since, after George, he's the next suspicious person, and we're looking for someone else going on a killing spree, looks to me like it's Thomas.
York said everyone was a suspect, then asked to see their backs, but he only looked at George, Thomas, and Emily's back.
Deadly Premonition is telling us everything. York only looked at 3 backs. That means there's only 3 suspects. And we've accounted for 2 of the 3 backs. As for our third back, that's a dude. So it can't be Emily.
Case closed, come on.
So that's what we think.
We don't have all the evidence yet. We might be wrong. We might be right. We might be crazy. But it just may be a lunatic we're looking for. Okay, I'll stop.